Hello, everyone. Welcome to the this is seventh episode of Tech Talks with Santosh, and we have a special guest from Armenia today, and his name is Armen. Armen works as a senior Angular developer, and he's also writer for In Depth. And I was really impressed by his series on Angular bad practices, so I decided to have a discussion why or what are the best practices inside Angular, right? So everyone, I'm sure if you are working on an Angular project and you have to go through all this best practices, what are the bad practices you should avoid. So we'll discuss that today. Thank you, Armen, for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Santosh. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay, so we will start discussing about the best practices. We'll discuss about RxJS and GRX anything. In case you have any questions, you can post it on the chat window, which is available to you, and we will take those questions during our live discussion. So let's go ahead and start, right, Armin? So what do you think are the common best practices which we should follow? So I have, of course, I mean, whenever a new Angular developer starts creating or start working on an application, they're really confused because I don't think so there is a guide where you can actually go ahead and find, okay, these are the best practices which you should follow. So what's your advice? So
when starting a new project, usually the very first best practice you want to follow is not do bad practices. The very first thing is try to avoid common mistakes that people
mm-hmm,
do. Because obviously there are things that if you do, life will be easier for you in the future of
yep,
your project. But those are things that you can sort of add to your application even later on. If, of course, when you want to write a project in a more better organized way,
mm-hmm,
there is a time constraint that you put yourself under. For example, what you do, any refactoring or like trying to come up with a better architecture for app, that takes time, which from managerial perspective is not obviously time that is spent on developing new features, which is the endpoint of your application, obviously. So if you are, especially if you are under any time constraint, first of all, you don't want to make mistakes.
mm-hmm,
You want to avoid doing common mistakes that people usually do when working in Angular. And that's the first thing. And the second thing I will talk about the mistakes that we commonly do in Angular
mm-hmm,
after this. But the next thing that you want to do is starting implementing a better architecture. You want to have a singular flow of everything in your app. You want to have, obviously for that, I suggest using NGRX, I suggest
mm-hmm,
using the flux pattern, but even if you don't do that, you have to come up with some consistent way of doing things in your app. If in one place you are using ArcGIS to do calls and then subscribe using async pipe, and then in another place you are using a promise to do that and stuff like that, obviously it complicates everything because you have essentially the same thing, you're loading data or something, but you do it in different ways. So first
mm-hmm,
thing, you need to have a singular flow of doing things.
mm-hmm,
Of course, NGRX helps there.
mm-hmm,
When, but before talking about that, if I say anything about bad practices that we usually have, they usually come up in two possible like scenarios.
mm-hmm,
They're they usually the people that are new to Angular obviously do that mistakes, and our aim is to help them. So usually there are two types of people that work on Angular. It's a bit different from like React. One type of people that work on Angular are just JavaScript developers that used to work on other frameworks or maybe plain JavaScript and are now switching to Angular. And another part of another type of people that work on Angular are people that were used doing something on the back end, for example, using
Okay.
languages like C Sharp. Angular is very popular among people that
Yeah.
use C Sharp because obviously TypeScript looks a bit like C Sharp, and the overall structure that Angular uses is a bit similar to like
Yeah.
.NET Core or stuff like that with OOP and dependency injection.
Yeah.
So those two types of people commit different types of mistakes. And usually when we talk about people that come from the backend, they start from abusing OOP.
Okay.
Angular is a bit misleading in that way. Obviously, it's built around OOP. You
Yeah.
write classes for everything, you write methods to bind to events, you write properties to store data, and stuff like that. Of course, you use dependency injection and so on. But you shouldn't be mistaken, Angular and not any front end like technology isn't really as OP as you have seen on the back end. It's not really like that. It's more, it has more flow to it that the general object-oriented programming does. Object-oriented programming is more like solid. They even have a pattern called solid
Yeah.
when we
Yeah.
work at it, right? In front end, we have too much, let's say, different flows of things, like different events happen,
Yeah.
data is loaded from the server, the user does something. We have to, like, sometimes we have scenarios when, for example, a user does something and the combination of what they do with data that arrives from, let's say, a WebSocket could be transformed into a result. And doing that just in an OOP way, like having a method with imperative code in it and stuff like that, isn't really helpful.
Okay.
Because we usually end up with, oh, I have to change this data here, but then the other method won't work because it uses the same data. I'm gonna change that too, and we end up trying to synchronize different methods, which isn't a good OOP practice. In OOP, we usually, it's about decoupling, right? We usually have
Yeah.
different methods to do different things.
Yeah.
So we end up with trying to synchronize everything together, which isn't that good. And the next thing that people could try and abuse in OOP is inheritance. I've seen I've seen
I can
very
relate. I
yeah, I
can relate
have
to
seen
that.
definitely. I have seen people trying to extend components from other components, which is I wouldn't say it is prohibited, but
Yeah.
in like 99% of the cases, you don't need that. Usually, you go with what they say in OOP. They say inheritance should only be used if there is a relationship. Like
Yeah.
you have
Exactly.
an like the proverbial example of, well, there is a class animal and there's a class horse, and the horse is an animal, so you can extend the
Yeah.
horse from animal, which makes sense.
Yeah.
But sometimes people just use inheritance to transfer functionality. Like, oh, these three different components have the same method. Oh, let's create a base class and put the method there. That's not how inheritance works.
Yeah.
That's not the purpose of inheritance. And
Exactly.
usually then, if you come up with a real case for inheritance, like, oh yeah, these three components are basically the same, we can inherit them. Oh,
Yeah.
but wait, one of them is inheriting a class with a single method for something, and then you have got a problem. So what I suggest two things to fix that problem. First, uh, go with the OP best practices. Don't just take a look at what people do in Angular. Sometimes people do bad things in Angular. Sometimes, yeah, you're not meant to use every feature that is available.
Exactly.
Like, oh yeah, there is an inheritance, I gotta use. No. And second, use mixins. Mixins is a great pattern that I have been using for a while now. So essentially, mixin is a function that returns a class, right? So it allows to have sort of multiple inheritance, like chain inheritance of different mixins. And after that, you could have different traits like methods in different mixins, and you can bring them together and put them on a component, and then you still can inherit that component from another one. and you still don't have any problems with what you have in classical inheritance. And you use classical inheritance only for cases when it makes sense. For example, right today, I had a case when I used inheritance on components was that I had different components for inline editing.
Okay.
You have a text, when you click on it, it turns into an input, then you change it. It can be an inline input, inline text area, inline multiple selecting box. So different inline editing, but same inline editing, but with different controls like drop down
Yeah.
and so on. So they shared lots of same functionality. Every single one of them had an if editing boolean on them. Every single one had a stop propagation method to catch the click event. Every single one of them had methods for control value accessor interface, like write value, get value, and they were all the same. And obviously, they were all representing a component that is doing inline editing. So I just created a base component that does inline editing, and that made sense because here is a class that does inline editing, which doesn't concern itself with what the actual control behind it is. And then I extended it to the components, and then I put in the HTML drop down or this and changed the other methods that were specific for an input or for a drop down and so on. So it made sense in that case. And I'm just trying to take a look and see if I have any code here on me that has mixins, and frankly I don't. But
Yeah.
I have if you want, I can show an example because mixins are really
Yeah. Sure.
underappreciated technology. I can just open up one of my old articles that I had
Yeah.
on in-depth. We had I suppose I have written about mixins in Angular. I guess it should be on in-depth, right?
Okay. So meanwhile, I mean, of course, object-oriented programming is one place where actually people abuse it, but people generally don't see the value as well. For example, we in my previous application, or we had a framework. So all the components had common properties. So all the components which we used to create had common input properties, and then we also had to give a functionality where we can actually render a component which can be provided by you. So we have a framework, but you can actually pass the component as well. Then we realized that, okay, now we are struggling because we don't know what will be the structure of the component, right? So we cannot guess, right? I mean, I'm not sure what you're going to pass.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so then we decided, okay, now after looking at everything, we came to know, okay, all the components has few basic input properties and output properties, and then we decided to move it to like the base class, and then we used to extend that base class, and also asked our client that in case you want to write your own component and render inside my framework, just go ahead and extend this particular class. So I think people should also think about it. I mean, if they need to add it before, or like just at the end when there is no choice, right? I mean, if they see that all the classes are same, then they should actually decide and add the base class concept.
Yeah, definitely. The thing about this is just in most cases you have to just take a look at the problem in depth. Sorry
Yeah.
for yeah. So when you take a look, you just need to realize: are you doing inheritance just because it's comfortable to do it right now, but it really doesn't make
Yeah.
sense? Or if it really does make sense, you should probably really do it right away, because the more you postpone it, it will be harder to refactor later.
Exactly.
Obviously.
Exactly.
Also, another thing that I always say: use object composition over inheritance, and also use it every time that you use third-party libraries. It's very useful. Like, for example, you use a third-party library for working with local storage, okay? Or with HTTP. Like, you don't like Angular's HTTP, so you use another one. Or even the Angular's HTTP, I usually write a wrapper around Angular's HTTP, but Angular's HTTP usually has a signature of methods that are, you don't really change the names up,
Exactly.
get, delete, post, patch, but other libraries might have different methods. So it's very useful because it's easy to test. So you can mock your own service instead of trying to figure out how another third-party library is working.
Exactly.
And also, you can easily change your dependency. If, for example, you upgrade to another version of Angular and that service you're using is no longer maintained and they don't support it in Angular 12, say, in the future, so you got a problem. You need to go through all your application,
Exactly.
change every single method name.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you just inject it into your wrapper, and you expose your wrapper class to your entire application. It's called the adapter pattern, if I
Yeah.
remember it
It's adapted.
correctly.
Yeah.
It's an OP pattern, right? So it's very useful in Angular as well. So in the future, if you want to change the third-party library, okay, go ahead. You will just edit one file and it will be done. You don't even need really to test it. It works. It is the same methods, just they are calling a different library. So if the library is working, then your code will work in the same way it used to. But of course, it's not always. You
Yeah. I
should
think we.
be.
Yeah. So we just have a few questions. So let's go ahead and take them. So the first question is from Shiva. So he says, what should we keep in mind when picking npm packages for implementing features? What parameter needs to be evaluated? So what do you think? It's a good library or bad library? How you will decide?
So usually, I have a bit more conservative approach to libraries. I guess I usually pick one library for UI components. Obviously, when you're picking a component for UI, you just want to go for a library that looks like the design you want.
Yeah.
If you want material design, go for Angular material. If you want a bit more freedom, you maybe use Bootstrap, ng Bootstrap. If you have more of an enterprise look, you can go for PrimeNG. Obviously, you just want to pick a library that looks closest to the design you want. If you, because I had an experience when we picked PrimeNG with a template, a paid template for a project, and then we just changed everything. The template, essentially, if you open that application now, you won't believe it's that template and that it's PrimeNG. It was not a good decision, obviously, on our part. So of course we learned something from it. You got to pick something that at least resembles what your end design looks like. Another part is, of course, you got to need a good API. Obviously, if there is a library that looks like your design but is horribly written, then you should at least have second thoughts, like, maybe this is too bad, maybe I'm not going to use it because it's problematic. But essentially, in the end, you are going to have to decide based on how useful that is for a project, and the more, and of course, obviously, not everything needs a library. There are lots of libraries out there. If there is a problem that you can solve in under 20 minutes, you don't need a third party to do that for you, because the more dependencies your project has, the more chance that in the future one of those dependencies will stop being supported, or will have a bad bug, or will have a security issue. So you want to keep your dependencies clean. Obviously, Angular itself comes with lots of dependencies. You have RxJS, you have Zone.js, all the stuff like that. Of course, those are well-maintained libraries. But what if in the future, like, the maintainers of Zone.js are like, oh, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. So one day you might have a problem, of course. So the Angular already comes with that burden of dependencies. You don't want to add too many to the equation. But of course, if there is a more or less big feature, for example, if you need something to draw, for example, a big canvas, of course, you're not going to write that from scratch, right? You're not going to use the old canvas methods that are pretty hard, Google it or something. You will probably spend several weeks doing that, and you could just use a library. So mostly you have like two variables. One is the usefulness, and one is the time that you would spend on implementing it yourself. If the time is a lot and usefulness is a lot, then you go for it with the library.
Yeah. So, okay. So another question which we have, I think, when it comes to the pure function, would you recommend having a util or an object, or it's in an object? So
Usually, I would say keep everything in your services because services come with auto-generated spec files, so you can write unit tests.
Yeah.
But the thing is, sometimes, for example, if you have a class that represents a model, right, for a data structure from your application, for example, a user model, and you need, say, one of the fields is a date field, and you need to do some conversions. Obviously, you cannot use the service because you cannot use the dependency injection.
Yeah.
If the
Exactly.
service is plain, like it doesn't have any dependencies itself, it only has pure functions on it, you can get an instance. You can just new the class and get an
Right.
object and use it. So in the end, I would say use the service for that. Though I have to confess, I am also guilty of just function having a file that has functions
Yeah.
.ts and the utility functions there. So it's not like the end of the world. If you have functions like that, it's not really a bad practice, but of course it would be preferable that you have a service with utility functions in it.
Okay. So I think one of the bad practices which you mentioned was misuse of directives. I mean, what are the scenarios where actually people misuse directives?
Sometimes people try to. Well, there are two cases. Sometimes they can solve a problem with the directive, and they don't think about it.
Okay.
Because most of the misleading thing is that people don't realize how flexible are Angular's directive selectors. Your directive selector doesn't have to be a property, doesn't have to be an HTML attribute. You can bind your directive to a class and do something dynamic on the CSS, for example, which you cannot do purely in a CSS file, but there is some logic to it. Usually people just, okay, we'll write ng class, then we will write logic for that class. But in reality, you could just write a directive, export it, and it will work fine on the case. I have a directive that I wrote myself. It's highlighting error fields. So
Okay.
it works this way. Uh, there is a generic structure in my application that I have elements that have class form control, and inside them are the controls like input, text areas, and of course the inputs and text areas use form control on them. So my directive is binding to all the div elements that have a form control class and a child that has a form control on it. So it's
Okay.
a complex selector, and then I inject the form control, and I check if the control is invalid. I will add another class on the parent directive automatically, and of course that class is highlighting the entire input saying that this is invalid. If I
Okay.
didn't do that directive, I would have I would either have to write ng class every time I wanted to do.
Exactly.
Actually, I believe there was an article by Nathaniel about writing a directive like that. It was more complex. It also added messages. It appended the error messages to it's a bit less flexible because you are working with the HTML search, but it's still a valid use case. So you could have solved a very like annoying problem that you every time I have to write ng class or something, solve the problem once and for all, but you don't go for it because you don't really know that directive selectors are so flexible.
Yeah.
And honestly, I bit blame the Angular documentation because it doesn't really mention in depth that you can have selectors like that. I mean, for people that are new to development or are new to Angular, they will just think, oh, okay, I have to write
Yeah.
some custom name here. You can bind to all the form elements in the application with your directive.
Yeah.
You can do that.
Yeah.
It's not always the best thing to do, but you can do that
Yeah.
sometimes. It's very helpful.
Yeah, I think I agree that to that as well, because there are a lot of advanced scenarios which documentation cannot cover, or they don't
Yeah.
have that good documentation. So people think about, okay, this cannot be the use case. Generally, thanks to the community, that they always think about all these edge cases, right, where you can
Yeah.
utilize it. And of course, Nathaniel Basil has great articles and great UI libraries as well, or libraries, Angular libraries. Thanks to him, I mean, I think he's saving a lot of time of all the developers out
Definitely.
there. Yeah. Okay. So I
Actually,
think. Mhm. Yeah, tell me.
Actually, I found the article on mixins. If you want, we
Okay.
can
Yeah, you want
take
to
a
share?
look at
Yeah,
it.
sure, sure.
Yeah,
Let me.
I will put it on the screen here. So this is one of my old articles. It's on some Medium. I guess I will
Yeah, sure.
republish
You
it
can share the link.
to in depth. It's a pretty old article. Yeah. So what mixins are, if you're not familiar with, let me just make it larger. So mixins are actually classes that, sorry, functions that return a class. They take a class as an argument and they return another class. So in this case, we take a base class that is something something we don't know. It returns another class that extends it and adds some functionality to it. So it's
Okay.
really neat. And then I can get another class. I build the class. I have a class called point here, and then I
Mm-hmm.
build a new class using this mixin, and I can just make an instance of this something called tag point that has this
Okay.
property on it.
Okay.
Uh, and then when I have this, I can actually use it in Angular for very like useful things. For
Mm-hmm.
example, I actually have a sorry. I think I have a better example of this. So yeah, I can use the mixin to solve a common problem that we have in Angular. Usually we know we have to unsubscribe from observables, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the most popular pattern and the one that I personally prefer is keeping a destroy subject on a component, right? Then using in engine on destroy, you're going to
Okay.
next subject once, and then you use something like take until in all your
Mm-hmm.
subscriptions, right? So the observable, so you don't have to keep the subscription and
Mm-hmm.
then call unsubscribe or something like that.
Unsubscribe
I like
everywhere.
that. Yeah, I like that pattern better. I think it's more beautiful. But of course, it's a bit tedious to have to rewrite this code in lots of components, like write a destroy subject and engine, destroy, implement. So I just wrote a
Yeah.
mixin for it. So here it is. What it does, it takes a base class, any class. It can be just an empty class in this case, or a default parameter, and then it returns just a base class that extends from this one and just adds the functionality.
Ah, okay.
So then I just write a has subscription component. So this is a component that has a subscription. I extend it from with destroy and another mixin. I use another mixin. I can pass another mixin to this. I can compose
Okay.
a class with different traits and then extend from it. And I still keep the ability to extend from another class. That's crucial. I still can add another class here.
Okay.
So I
That's good.
don't break the inheritance chain. I don't make this class not extensible from anything. It's too flexible, so I don't lose on anything. And now I just can use the destroy subject here, and it will unsubscribe in the engine destroy. I don't have
Ah.
to write the engine destroy either. If I have to write engine destroy for other purposes, I just have to call super.engine destroy, obviously, but that is just what you do in inheritance, so it is
Mm-hmm.
not really a of course, the most problematic case with mixins is decorators are problematic. So if you do something like input in a mixin
Mm-hmm.
class, Angular will mess it up. You have to write something like this. You have
Okay.
to define inputs manually so it works. I do that because I have cases that obviously not always, only if I extend from mixin that has inputs, input decorators, then I write inputs by
Mm-hmm.
hand because production build won't work without it. Angular will be like, oh, this doesn't have the input, but you say it has.
Okay.
Problem. There is an issue open on Angular, so I believe they will fix this in the future. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
sort of half temporary problem.
Okay.
But in the end, mixins are very useful
That's,
to
yeah.
like doing. For example, if you have different pages that have tables that you can filter and sort and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
all of them are calling the same methods. So it makes sense to make a mixin that says like with queries or with something something returns a function, you keep the inheritance, you get the functionality. So it's very flexible. I think mechanics are a bit underappreciated in Angular. Obviously, we fix on functional programming a lot, and that's good. We promote RxJS, pure functions, but also OOP also has some useful things that we can bring and use in Angular.
Yeah, this is really cool use case. I think I have seen some examples using higher order component, which is still, I think, not fully.
It's sort of like a higher order component.
Yeah,
Obviously,
yeah,
it's a function that returns a class that is a component, but
yeah,
it's not exactly working on your own components. You just extend from another component that is
yeah.
composed.
No, that's cool.
I guess a
So,
very good example.
yeah, so let's take some questions we have.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sashank has a question. Do you think Angular lags behind React.js when it comes to unit testing? I have worked on both. I think just is pretty straightforward.
I think, well, you can use just on Angular.
Exactly,
Obviously. Yeah. If the testing framework is the problem, if you don't like the Jasmine, right?
Yeah, just
If you don't like Jasmine, you can use another framework. You can
yeah,
also
exactly.
use Jest. But I guess Angular components usually are a bit harder to test because they usually come with a lot of overhead. They're usually more bloated than React components just by nature. Because we have properties, there are all classes. Usually nowadays in React, they mostly revert to functional components using hooks. Which is of course completely fine, but they're easier to test a bit, yes. And also another problem in Angular is dependency injection. Of course, it's useful for unit testing, obviously, because you can mock it. But people get overwhelmed when your component has like 12 dependencies, so you
Exactly.
mock them all, and of course it takes lots of time. And all of that code is just pure boilerplate.
Exactly.
Obviously, it's not very exciting to work on something like that. But there are things that you can do. Thing one, you can use a library called ngmocks. Of course, there are other solutions to that too, but I have personally used ngmocks. ngmocks will take components, directive services, and return mocked versions of them, so you can inject them into your testing module. It will, for example, if you give it a component, it will generate an empty version of that component that just has the inputs and outputs, so it works fine. So you don't have to redeclare everything from this mock and stuff like that. And also the test will work faster because the child components won't actually render because they're empty. You don't need them to render. You're testing the parent component, obviously. So it's very useful. And another thing that you can do is obviously NGRX. Use NGRX or another state management tool, but NGRX is the one that I personally recommend. When you use NGRX, you don't inject services into components. You only select the data from the store, and you can easily mock selectors. You just can take a selector, say, okay, switch to this data, switch to that data, then assert that something happened in the component. Is very easy, and you don't have any other dependency. You just inject the store, maybe something from Angular if you, for example, need the router or something in the component, but you don't inject your data services.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ergo, you don't have to mock them, and that is great. And effects, you can also easily test them because effects are just actually functions that work with the data. You will then have to mock only in one place. You don't have to mock for lots of components. You just mock them for one effect, and that's it.
Yeah, I think there is one more mistake which people do make is I have seen a lot of developers testing the UI. I mean, they are actually testing if this element exists inside their unit test case. I mean, I'm sure most of the time it does not make sense. So I think, what do you
What I
think about
usually did is what I usually did was well, it could make sense if you don't have integration tests. Okay, if you solely rely on unit tests, which is obvious, of course, real life can't be like ideal. Of course, it would be great if we had the end-to-end test, integration test, and unit test, and everyone did that. But obviously, sometimes it's just that, for example, you don't have enough testing capabilities to resort to unit tests. You gotta be careful not to turn your unit test into end-to-end test. Like, oh, click here, something should happen there. No, the most I did when touching the UI was like emulate a click on a button, make sure that a function is being called, and then only test the function and everything that happened inside the state of the component. I don't need to go and check everything that happens inside. There are integration tests for that. But I could do that if it was necessary. So it's still not a good thing to do, but I guess in the end, sometimes that is necessary.
Exactly. Just sometimes it's just to cover the code coverage.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we have another question from Webho. Can you please explain some best practices while handling server side I think it should be server side error. I'm not sure. Service side errors in Angular, should it be done inside an
I think they mean errors that we get in services that work with HTTP.
Okay.
Well, that depends. Of course, one answer they always go to use NGRX. You can do anything with NGRX.
I think I think we are going to discuss about NGRX as well. So I think the answer, shortest answer could be NGRX. So let's discuss about NGRX, and we'll finish all this question, and then anyways, we are going to discuss about.
Okay. So
I think Guru Raj so Guru has a question that what are the best practices to follow while refactoring old project? So
that's a favorite question. I guess most of my life is refactoring old projects. Which actually can be exciting sometimes. So what I usually do is first start with the structure, start with your folders, start with your modules. If there is no lazy loading implemented, the very first thing you need is lazy loading, especially if you have many modules. So don't touch the code at first, start with the folders. You need a neat structure. What I usually suggest is, for example, have a core module with the functionality that is relevant to all parts of the application, say the HTTP module and stuff like that, import them there. I usually usually work with applications that have public pages, like where you don't need to log in to see them, and private pages that you need to create two modules for those different things with their own routing and lazy loading. Obviously, you can lazy load a module in a module that itself is lazy loaded, so you can have infinite nesting of lazy loaded modules, and that is good. And then follow the structure of your app. For example, you have different links in your app. Say, for example, you have a sidebar that has different items. So every item should be a lazy loaded module with its own subset of features. Structure that. Actually, it feels a bit hard, but it's the easy part. You're not refactoring any code. You're not touching what is working. You're just moving the pieces around. You can fix that in 2 days, and you won't just only get a folder structure that is nice. You will also get a performance boost if you didn't have lazy loading. With lazy loading, you will have smaller bundles and more efficient rendering. So go for it first. After that, when you have completed that step, work on changing file names. File names are very important. You want to have explicit file names. So, for example, I want to share my screen because I have a nice thing. Okay. So in this project that I'm showing, I'm gonna just expand the file bar because I am going to show what goes on here. So in this project, I have different pages, right? So I have a pages module that incorporates all the pages that I have in my application. All of them are lazy loaded, but it's not exactly what I want to show this moment. I have a state folder that has all the NGRX stuff in it. And I have also divided this by feature. You should always divide everything you have by feature, not by file type. That's an old, very old advice, very useful. Don't have like, oh, these types of TS files should be together because they're TS files. No, that's not how you do it. You structure them by feature. So this is something about bookmarks. In my application, there is an entity called bookmarks. So everything about bookmarks is in this folder. And here, although that obviously, for example, so here I have bookmarks.actions, bookmarks.adapter, bookmarks.effects, bookmarks. And so on. So you could say, well, why do you write bookmarks every time? Obviously, they are inside the bookmarks folder. So obviously, why don't just call it actions? And but that way I will have lots of files that are called actions in my component, in my application. And when I try to open a file, if I write actions, I will get lots of files, and I will have to read the exact path to really see if that's the one that I need. But if I write the book.action, I'm sorry, if I just write book.actions, it will. I just put a comma here. Really bad at typing, so it just brings the exact file that I need. Also, if I open lots of different files, say I open 3 or 4 files, and let's say action here. If I do that and I take a look at the open files in the header, if I see 4 files that are called action.ts, I will be very confused with which one is the one I need. You may think that this is something that's not very important, but it's actually very useful, and you can do it very fast. It will take like 2 hours at best to change all the file names. Even if your project is huge, it's not that hard, and the benefit is very big because in the future, less frustration and more time that you can spend on actually coding rather than, oh, I gotta find this file. Oh, this was the wrong file I was looking. Sometimes I had been editing a wrong file all along because of the
you are not alone. I have done that.
good names, even if they're a bit longer, more explicit, are better. Also, it's easy to explain. You say go to bookmarks.reducer.ts. Not open the bookmark folder in the state folder, and there you will. You say the exact file name and it's a unique file name, easy to find. After that, in the fourth step, you start refactoring your code. And here there are 2 paths that you can take. One is if you have enough time and resources to refactor the architecture. If you want to bring something new, say, for example, NGRX or other state management, or maybe another pattern, of course, you can still do that. If you are taking that path, then you should really carefully think what you are doing before going forward, structure that part, and then implement it everywhere. Right? If you throw yourself at, oh, okay, I'm going to do NGRX, okay, this component selector, blah, 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 and then you will find out that it's a mess because your reducers are in different places, selectors are in different, you got to structure them. If you're not doing architectural code refactoring, for example, if you don't have enough time, or if you just, if the architecture is fine, not bad, you don't want to refactor, then just go over and just use the nuanced best practices. Use mixins wherever they're applicable, remove bad inheritance patterns, and so just sort of look around. Also run nglint. Almost all the projects that don't have a pipeline in a CI have linting problems. My project definitely does. We don't have a CI. So I sometimes go around and do nglint, and 2 or 3 errors will come up to fix them. That's useful. Don't disregard the tool. And I guess after that you will get, when you see different files in your application, get a better grip how to do other stuff too. So those are the first initial steps. If you take them, it will be easier after that.
I think that was a very detailed explanation, Armen. So I think it will be helpful for the new users, whoever watched these videos as well. So we will come back to the questions, and now we will discuss about some bad practices or good practices which should be considered while working with RxJS. So what do you think about it?
Well, that's a painful topic to be honest, because
I mean, yes,
man, I wish Sirkan was on this call. he would make a great facial expression about it. So, well, first of all, use NGRX. Sorry, RxJS. You also use NGRX, but we'll talk about it a bit later. Use RxJS. NGRX comes with some overhead. RxJS doesn't. It is already inside Angular. You are working with RxJS every day. If you use HTTP service, if you are using outputs, if you are using Angular material, you are working with RxJS. So if you want it, if you don't want it, you still have to get familiar with RxJS. If you're not, start from learning the most important operators that are there, like filter, map, start with things like that that are useful. Take until, that is also very much used in Angular. We just saw in the mixing example. So start with that. If you don't know really RxJS that well, start with learning the operators. After that, move on to learning functions that combine observables like merge, combine lattice and stuff. They're not really that hard. They seem a bit abstract first, but when you dive a bit into them, you just realize how easier it's actually to work with them than with the imperative logic you have. And then start understanding where you can use RGS to fix a problem.
Yep.
It's not always, the answer is not always. Another bad practice is that people sometimes come, oh, I'm going to just shove RxJS at everything that comes. I've seen a project that had several subjects for a simple Boolean, 3 or 4 subjects in different contexts, passing that around. It was impossible to fix a bug there. We just didn't know where the event originated. Obviously, RxJS comes with the downside that the debugger is not that useful, because you have a composed function different. You can just put a debugger statement on an operator and expect it to work. You have to, that's why we use tab a lot, something like that. Console log, again, is your best friend when working with REG. But obviously that's a downside, but it's not a very big downside. If you're careful, you won't really have to do debugging that much if you're using RxJS.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you already know how to structure, the RxJS comes with flow mentality in it. Like you don't treat your data as just a box that is somewhere. You treat your data as things. Your data is subject to change, so you work with it as it is changing all the time. You don't work with the box. You work with a million boxes that are on a conveyor belt, right? They're coming, so you just can combine different streams and do stuff like that, and it becomes really easy. So the best thing is whenever you can resort to using RxJS, it's always very useful. You don't write methods, you write less methods, you write a property. This is an observable that combines this streams, gets a new one, filters maps, blah, blah. You get, it's just one property. It's easier, it's easier to reason about. In my first article on RxJS, that's the main talking point in RxJS in Angular, right? The part 1. The main talking point is that it's easier to talk about properties of a class than about methods, right? If you just do a property that's a string, yeah, it's a big one, but you just need to read this piece of code that describes what this observable is, and that's it. You don't. It's an observable. No one can do anything to it, right? You cannot change it. You cannot. So obviously, it's not used in the methods, right? You don't have to find, oh, where is this observable used? Nowhere. Just declare it here and subscribed in the HTML using async type. So it's easier to find where your code is.
Yeah, that's really cool thing about RxJS. But once you understand it, so I think the learning is the difficult part, right? So once you figure out, okay, this is how RxJS works, and you are comfortable with few operators, as you said, then you will realize the true value of RxJS.
Yeah, of course, at first it's a bit overwhelming. You don't like, especially if you're not familiar with RxJS at all, at first it's overwhelming. I have been there. In the first project that I was doing, we actually converted all the observables from HTTP to promises, because we knew promises. We didn't have any idea about observables. And it was understandable at that point. We have to learn lots of things, and RxJS just wasn't one of them. But then, like 3 months later, I was like, oh man, we missed out so much. And then we then refactored it back to use observable. It's been a journey.
I mean, I've been in that place as well. So we had a long discussion about observable versus promises, and then the other team decided to use promises, and then I had to refactor after like 6. Yeah, so I had to refactor everything back to services, say observables, like after 6-7 months. Yeah.
When I wrote my first article on best practices, it was in 2017. I still remember one guy arguing with me in the comment section. Was like, "Oh, you don't have to use observables. You miss out on using async await." And I was like, "Yeah, sure. I
We really
actually
want to.
use async await while until I switch to NGRX completely, and I understand async await is an imperative pattern."
Yeah.
If you're going down that path, you essentially say, I don't like functional programming, I don't understand functional programming, or I just deliberately choose not to use it, which is fine. Of course, obviously, no one is going to argue with you, oh, you should use functional programming. But if you use async await, you basically say that my logic is going to be imperative. I'm not using declarative function. That's fine, but it doesn't have, it's a cool feature. It looks cool. You can write async code like it's synchronous, but in the end, it doesn't give you any upside.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's
okay,
like
a cool
what's
line of
called done.
code. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I can just don't have that line of code. I can just have an
It does.
observable.
Yeah.
So,
So I mean, the good news to have all the listeners here. So the biggest problem is with using RxJS is to decide when to actually or how to think reactively, right? So how to think reactively. That's the biggest issues all the developer gets. So I have a good news that Jan Nicholas Wortman is going to be on the show to talk about the same topic. So we will be discussing about how you can start thinking reactively while writing the RxJS code. So it will be useful for even if you are working in React or you are working in Vue or
oh,
even
great.
you are working. Yeah, that's in next month. So yeah, look, just look for keep looking for this. I don't want. I mean, I'm sure you don't want to miss that episode as well. Okay, so we'll take some questions and then we'll discuss about NGRX. Or
Yeah,
let's talk about NGRX. I think that will cover most of the questions here. So, what
yeah,
you
sure.
think is like best practices using NGRX, and why should we use NGRX if we talk about best practices?
Well, let's start with the later question on why we should use NGRX. So here comes here comes a very opinionated like advice. It's super opinionated. If you don't agree with me, fine. Maybe maybe I'm wrong. Okay, I will accept my mistake in the future if I realize I'm wrong. But it's one of the things that I'm just sure I'm right. If your application is big enough to use Angular, then it's big enough to use NGRX.
Okay.
Angular, when you open Angular's homepage, it says, "Oh, enterprise application." We usually think it's just a fancy word, but what it really means is that it's aimed on building enterprise applications.
Exactly.
Applications that have lots of features, creating data, manipulating data, filtering data, sorting data, working with all stuff related with data. So if you don't use NGRX, don't use RxJS, working with lots of data imperatively is a mess. Honestly,
Yeah.
like erasers. Obviously, most of the viewers here are aware of the array methods, right? Map,
Yep.
filter on the array. I mean, not RxJS, just usual.
Hmm.
Just go back to the moment when you learned about those methods and remember how fascinated you have been to, oh man, I don't need to write a for loop. I don't need a while loop, a for loop. This looks better. This is more explicit, and it's actually shorter. So it's a win-win. Like
Yeah.
you don't
Exactly.
have to write more code, and you don't have to write implicit code.
Yeah.
You just take a look. Oh, filter based on a condition. It's obvious.
Works.
If you
Yeah.
write a for loop, so for loop is imperative. Array methods are declarative or functional. If you go back to that moment and you think that, oh yeah, I'm not gonna use a loop. I'm gonna use array methods, and then think about this. You have a huge app with just huge amounts of data, hundreds of arrays, hundreds of objects. Are you really gonna use for loops for them, or are you gonna use array methods for them?
Yeah.
I think if the answer is obvious for you, then you're gonna think, well, okay, if I'm developing this app, will I use lots of different methods called in different times to manipulate the data, there, emit data from one component, getting in another, manipulate it, and all that mess? Or I'm going to come up with a more functional approach, which is NGRX. Of course, again, you can choose another library, but still choose one that is reactive.
Yeah.
Choose one that gives you an opportunity to work with observables. Observables are the golden thing that Angular has about it. Man, I swear, if RxJS wasn't in Angular, it would not be able to compete with React or some. RxJS inside Angular is the greatest thing we really have in this framework. Obviously, there are lots of other good features like dependency injections and all
Hmm.
the things we have, but RxJS inside Angular is saving us a lot. In React, they have just functional components.
Yeah.
Obviously, if we could use if it had better integration with RxJS, it would be even better. I mean React, but even if it doesn't have, if you use the hooks, it gives a little bit of resemblance of what we have in RxJS. This data, you can transform it, so on. It's responding to use a reducer. There's a use reducer hook and stuff like
Hmm.
that. But with RxJS, there comes a set of operators that are
Hmm.
so powerful
Powerful. Yeah.
that you can just like the other thing that I tweeted last day, the inactive pop-up on Twitter, right? It's just two lines of code. You can implement something that in imperative code would be something like this. I didn't even think how to implement it in an imperative way. One of my coworkers asked me later, he said, man, I got a big problem. I want to do this in RxJS way. Can we try to solve it? And we sat down. It was like 10 o'clock or something, but we came up with two lines of code, which is just so great. I just decided, okay, I'm going to go quit it because it's pretty impressive. You can do something like that in just two lines of code, which are more understandable than imperative code and shorter. So again, win-win. So when it comes down to using NGRX, it not only lends you more possibility to work with better code, but it also changes the architecture of your app. You have to come up with a good structure. You have different features, so you have to load feature states for them. You got to write selectors. Logic, all this mess is moving away from the components. Why is it good? Because you have many components, but you have only one state. You have only your application. Even if you have 100 components with different data, you still have one state. Anytime you might be required to have the same state as in another component. For example, you have two different components that are far apart from each other. And one is using some data from the server, it loads it itself. Okay, using a server without NGRX, without anything. Oh, and then one day you realize you need that data in another component too. If you don't have NGRX, if you don't have any state management, you have got to do a lot of, I don't know, mixing stuff up. Emit event somewhere, read it, and HTML becomes a mess. All the components are emitting loads of data, loads of inputs that arrive into the components, and so on and so on and so on. And when you take a look at HTML, you don't really see UI. You see flows of data which don't really belong there. You're supposed to get the data and display it, not to get the data from below, get the data from up, pass it each to other. It's a real mess. And NGRX solved it for you, and NGRX also solves your even your folder structure. When you work with it, you got to structure it in some way. And when you structure your state, when you find out, okay, if these states belong together, maybe these components belong together because they're really close. They work with the same things, and your folder structure also becomes better. And how much better your code becomes if we can share the screen. I have a lot of NGRX code in this application, particularly. So I'm not going to take a look at the NGRX because this is not a talk on NGRX. This is a talk on how NGRX helps what we already have in Angular. So I'm going to open up a component. Let's say the bookmarks component. So this is a simple application. It's not very hard. It's not that simple. We have articles and we have bookmarks. You can bookmark an article to read it later. Okay, it's a basic example, but still a use case for NGRX, obviously. So the bookmarks component is the component itself is just a single property, an ng on it that just sets the title. This is really relevant. We can just don't think about it. We just set the document, and it just injects two things. So in this case, we don't even, I guess in this component, we don't even throw, we load the bookmarks when the application is loaded in my app. So I don't even wait until the user goes to the bookmark. All that logic is handled in the effect. In this case, I just say, please give me all the bookmarks I have.
Exactly.
Okay, this is what the component says. And then in the HTML, I'm just like, so please display the article list using this bookmark, the articles that are from the book. So it's extremely simple. The article list component itself is just a pure component. It receives a list of articles, renders them, doing stuff. And then when I need to perform an action, I don't need a service. If I go to the article item component, which is one single article, it has different features on it, like share on social media or bookmark or unbookmark. So you can bookmark them. So if
Okay.
you go, if you were using imperative logic, first of all, this component would inject say bookmark service, call something like get bookmark, subscribe, catch error, blah blah blah, all the things, load the data. Also, to this, if you wanted to display a loading, you would have to keep a boolean and make it true, make it false on error or success, and so on. So you would have quite a bit of code. And then inside your other component, you would have to do the following in this component that says, sorry, I just try to find it. So this is the article item component. It displays a material card. It uses material design. So here it has a button that says share, and it has also a button that says bookmarks so you can bookmark an article. So the problem, if we use imperative programming, first of all, it would be very hard to determine if an article is in the bookmarks or not. Trust me,
Right.
because you need the list of all the articles that are here and all the bookmarks that you have. And then you have to rerun a logic that computes if an article is inside the bookmark every time when the bookmarks change. So if the bookmarks change in another component, you have to emit an event or something, then get it here, rerun a method, change the boolean that you have, and redisplay it.
Yep.
In RxJS, you just select the bookmarks. Sorry, just close the Explorer so we have better look. So what I did is just I selected all the bookmark IDs using the selector, and then just mapped this article ID, which I received as an input, and I checked if it is included in the bookmark IDs. That's it. So here I have, is the article in bookmarks? So that's it. And another thing I just checked, if this bookmark is loading, if its status is changing. So what I did was just select those bookmarks that are loading right now, and find out if those IDs have, this IDs is a set of all the bookmark IDs, and so on. So I just get what I need just using nginx selectors and the RxJS pipe. So there is no other logic. If I want to add a bookmark, I just call dispatch add to bookmarks. That's it, and everything will synchronously. When bookmarks is dispatched, add to bookmark section is dispatched, the bookmarks will automatically update. They are an observable. They are a stream. They're not just a piece of data. They're a stream of data. And after that, when my article is inside the bookmark, this selector observable will run again automatically, obviously, because it's an observable. This function will run again, and if this article was added to bookmarks, the bookmark status will change to true. And again, we have very little code to do this. Particularly not very big, but still a large feature that will require a lot of code if we were doing that imperatively. So after seeing all things like that, I haven't been using, and I really regret it that I didn't start using nginx sooner. I think it's the 6th or 7th month that I'm using nginx. Obviously, nginx is way older than that. Before that, of course, I've heard about it. I tried to learn about it. Sometimes even I thought, oh, maybe this is over engineering. My projects aren't this complex. Now I realize that, yeah, man, this isn't over engineering. Actually, what I was doing with imperative logic was over engineering. Yeah, and this is just a pure approach. Over engineering is trying to take care of things that aren't real. Okay, these things are real. You need to take care of the data flow. nginx you to. So what I usually say, you might think, oh, well, I need to learn nginx. Of course, it's a concern, but trust me, it would be faster than you anticipate. Don't be intimidated. Just throw yourself at it. That's what I believe, actually. If you have any questions, there's a big community. People will help, and you definitely, it's just a little another approach. If you have managed to learn OP, you will definitely manage to learn Flux. Because it's actually simpler than OP. OP has all these concepts, inheritance, polymorphism, I don't know, dependency injection, blah, blah, blah. All of them are useful patterns, but they're actually harder than what we have in Flux. which is the pattern that NGRX or Redux or all those frameworks are built on. They're
they-
all built on Flux. Flux is a very simple pattern. It says that you have a reducer. It's a pure function. It gets the state. It gets an action. Based on an action, it decides what the next state will be. It's extremely simple. Effects are the same. Effects also are very simple. They look intimidating because you have all these RGS operators like merge map and stuff like that. But if we take a look at any effect that I have here, for example, the article effect, for example, the effect that handle the articles. If you open it, most of it just says, for example, load something, or for example, initiate search. Okay, so take this action. If this action happens, then call these articles to call this method, and then just switch to different actions. So this logic here is a bit complicated, but usually you won't have anything this complicated. In most cases, you will have something easy like this one.
Yeah, exactly. Load and
or like
load,
this.
add,
Load,
create.
get article, map or cache error, and that's it. The pattern is also simple. An action comes, you perform a side effect, return another action that describes the result. That's it. It's actually very simple. You don't have to be intimidated by ArcGIS operators. So that's it. Start with ArcGIS. When you're a bit more familiar with most popular operators like map, merge map, switch map, stuff like that, then you can move to NGRX and not be intimidated or overwhelmed.
Yeah. Great. Cool. I think so we explained we actually took care of NGRX as well. I think now we can go back to the question. There are many questions which are pending. So let's So there is a question from Gaurang. Which is the best way to extend style of reusable component? What do you think?
I guess I don't really. I'm not sure I understand
I
the
think
question.
override. I think he wants to override some of the styles of a component
In a third-party library.
Yeah.
So
like Angular or
well, the short answer is don't do that, obviously. But if you absolutely have to do that, don't use ngdeep. Ngdeep is deprecated and it's going to be removed. And also, it's a very rude thing to do. Actually, it's like, oh, in this component, I need a third library driver, but please shut up about the styles that other developers wrote. Don't do that. Only override third-party styles in the styles.scss folder at the root of your application. Everything that you write in the styles.css is applied to entire application. It traverses Shadow DOM. It applies to everything that is inside the web page. So there you can override the things that you do, but you have to be careful and ask yourself a question. If you're overriding everything, was that the correct UI library needed? If you just took Angular material and say turned it into something enterprisey like PrimeNG, for example, or something like Bootstrap, maybe it made sense to use Bootstrap.
Yeah, exactly.
Also make use of theming. Choose libraries that have theming.
Yep.
You can use Angular material themes to get something that looks way different from what usual Angular material is without overriding anything. There also, I have discovered a fancy online tool in which you can select different colors and font sizes and stuff like that. And it will auto-generate.
Actually, auto-generates.
Actually, you don't have to learn Angular theming if you don't have time for that, or if you're not particularly good at CSS, which I'm not. I'm not good at CSS.
Same here.
I really don't like working. I like CSS, but I don't like working on it because I'm not efficient at it. And so again, for me, if there is a shortcut in CSS, I would take it because other way it would be way longer for me. So you can find theming guides for other libraries. PrimeNG has a theming guide. We have used PrimeNG theming guide in our project. So, point one, don't use ngdeep and override stuff in your components. Point two, choose a library that allows theming. And if you absolutely need to override things, do it in the style CSS. Or if there is a bit too much code, not that much as to question if you should override it or not, but a bit too much for one file. You can always create another file, let's say extension CSS or something like that, and put everything.
Partial CSS files.
Yeah, and import them into style. That would be the acceptable approach.
Okay, so there is a next question. Use set timeout sometimes may delay the user experience. What is the best way to avoid set timeout?
Why are you
I mean,
using set?
yeah, exactly. Don't use that timeout. I think there are a lot of
Yeah,
operators.
it's more of a straightforward thing. If you need set timeout for something like you need to wait one iteration of the event loop to perform
Mm,
something, sometimes things like that come up. You can use a macro task queue, which RxJS provides you two schedulers, async scheduler, which is basically set timeout with zero time,
okay.
and ASAP scheduler that is basically a promise that resolves not immediately, but after one event loop cycle. So if you need to delay something, but not too much, like for example, sometimes if you use set timeout zero, of course we know that it's not zero milliseconds, it's
Yeah.
400 or
Yeah.
500 depending on the situation in the event loop. So of course, yes, sometimes you may get a little delay, especially if you have a slow computer or the browser is lagging, sometimes using
Yeah.
even set time at zero. But if you use ASAP scheduler, then you get the fastest. Promise queues, the promise resolve queues are always prioritized over set timeout and other events. There are macro
Okay.
task queue, which resolves as soon as possible. That's why it's called ASAP scheduler. So you can import ASAP scheduler from RxJS and call ASAP scheduler.schedule, pass in a callback, and that callback will be executed sort of as soon as
Got it.
possible after one iteration of the loop. So
That's cool.
I guess that's the best you can do.
Okay. So I think this is question from Melissa. How can we reduce the bundle size of a big app using ng build -hyphen or AOT -hyphen prod is not enough? I think yes, they are not enough. So what
Yeah,
do you suggest,
definitely.
Armut?
Well, first of all, you don't have to use the AOT
AOT.
flag
Yeah.
because prod is already AOT. And
Mhm.
the thing is, well, it really comes down to what goes on in your application. First of all, the
Yeah.
first thing that I mentioned, lazy loading. You need to lazy load modules. If you don't lazy load modules, to switch to lazy loading, it probably, like 95% of cases, will solve your
Yeah.
problem. If
Yeah.
it still doesn't, then go to the extreme lazy load every single page you have. If all the components are so massive that you can't have three components in a module, three page, let's say, components in a module, it's still up. You can lazy load even them. I usually don't do that. It's an
Mm.
overkill in most if your application is so large that you still can do that. You can go to the extreme.
Yeah.
With Ivy, you can actually lazy load components, not
Yeah.
modules. You can do that using ng component outlet also with async pipe. Take a look into that. If you really, for example, you have a component that uses a big third-party app, but this component itself isn't really necessary all the time, so you can lazy
Mhm.
load it later when it's needed. You can lazy load it. That's also an approach. So first thing,
Yeah.
lazy loading. Next thing you can do, take a look of what the libraries are that you use.
Mhm.
Chances are if you really have a bloated bundle size, chances are you're using something that you don't really need. Uh, or maybe importing something that you don't really need. If you want to go to the real extreme to try optimize the hell out of your application, take a look at, for example, the RxJS operator. Sometimes people use operators that they don't really need. That also happens. You may discard the import. Also, there are operators that combine functions of different operators without importing them, so you can also use them. Also, again, don't use third-party code to solve problems that you can solve under 20
Mm.
minutes.
Yeah.
Some
Exactly.
third-party code is bloated.
Yeah.
Like they write a function that does a straightforward thing, and you think, okay, this function is there, I can import it from a library. But actually, they try to handle every possible case that you
Mm.
don't have in your app. So you
Exactly.
can have if you can have a more miniature version of the function, just write it yourself. Don't use library. Also, use Angular material. It's lighter, of
Recheckable.
my experience. Yeah. But again, don't make it the primary thing that you decide on. You can optimize using lazy loading. You can always do that.
Cool. I think so. The next question is from Guru Raj: core versus common module, which is good naming convention. What do you think? I mean,
Oh, I have both.
I hate both. Exactly. That was I was
Yeah, I
supposed to
have
say.
both because core is usually stuff that see, common is things that can be used in some component somewhere. Say a pipe, okay, can be used somewhere, cannot be used somewhere, or a service that maybe use somewhere, maybe not. Or directives. Common module is a good place for directives, for example. You place them there, they're used everywhere. Most of them are. Usually don't have directives that work with the business logic of your
And
application, right? So you don't have to really put them into feature modules. So you can put them in a common module.
common module. Yeah.
Core module, on the other hand, is just the most necessary basic things your application needs. So the common module from Angular, most probably HTTP module. If you're using NGRX, then put the NGRX for root inside core module. Obviously, you want to load your state as soon as possible. And effects too, obviously, the sooner your effects work, the sooner your state will be there. So put them in the core. Well, of course, what you need,
Yeah.
not all the state
Everything. Yeah.
divided by the feature yet. And also, if you use translations for app, obviously you want them loaded first things. Also define the translation inside the core module. That's also a concern. So I guess have both. Core is a thin module with all the most necessary things that you should have, and common is a more relaxed, like reusable components, small that aren't really tight. Important thing, stuff in the common module isn't something related to the business logic. You should never put something related to the business logic there. You should put basic things like error highlighting directive that I mentioned. It goes into the common because it doesn't really work with the business logic. Business logic belongs in the feature modules.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there is a question from Ramesh. When it comes to code coverage, how should we treat dependency injection? Code coverage things we should also test for when it's undefined. How should we handle it? I mean, I think he's talking about the cases, right? So you have to
Yeah.
always take into consideration multiple things.
First things, don't make code coverage into a religion.
Yep.
100% code coverage doesn't mean that you don't have bugs, obviously.
Exactly.
Some cases aren't really worthy of
Mm.
checking. That all depends on the implementations. I guess 80 to 85%
It
coverage,
is
if you
good.
have that, it is pretty good.
Yeah.
Most of the cases, you should be attentive. You don't write unit tests to replace manual testing or
Yeah.
automation testing. You write unit tests to prevent from breaking changes
Changes. Yeah.
and things to go really bad. And if there is a tiny case that you didn't test, there's almost zero chance that someone may break something with that line of code.
Exactly.
You don't really have to be that anxious about it. On the other hand, if you have just 30% of code coverage, then obviously in the other 70% of the code, there may be lots of things that may be dangerous. Again,
Yeah.
you should be careful, you should consider what your application works with, but never like pray to code coverage. It's not that important. It's not that
Exactly.
important. What is important is that you understand the flow of everything in your app.
Cool. Okay, so Shashank, thank you so much. So I think there is another question from Shashank. What are the things which even experienced developer missed out during development that are not supposed to be missed? Do you think there is anything?
Oh yeah, a lot. I think I mentioned lots of things
Yeah.
in my I missed out on RxJS. I could have started learning it way sooner. I missed a lot on NGRX.
NGRX, yeah.
I could have learned it. So it depends on you on what trajectory your career goes,
Yep.
and it's not sad thing is not always in your hands. Like you take on a project and the management has decided that you are going to use this technology, and then you're stuck with it. So obviously, sometimes I know lots of great developers that work with technologies that are outdated, but that's their job. Obviously, they would prefer to work with something else, but that's where they are. So you gotta miss out on lots of stuff. You don't
Yep.
need to overload it. Don't be anxious if you think, oh man, I really need to learn this. For example, if after the discussion, oh man, I really need to go learn RxJS. Yeah, it would be useful if you do, but if it's going to be detrimental for any aspect of your life, don't do that. Obviously,
Cool.
don't be afraid of missing out.
Yeah. So Webhub has a question. So he says, how is build generated by Angular CLI different from build generated by any static site generator like Scully or Gatsby in case of React?
I guess the difference is very big because
Yeah.
Angular CLI doesn't generate a static site.
Yep.
Angular CLI doesn't generate actually any HTML.
Yep.
the HTML that you write gets converted to TypeScript and then to, of course, transpiled to JavaScript commands that build the application from scratch. You don't have any HTML in your Angular, to be
Yep.
precise. Static site generators do the opposite. They take your logic that you have in your application. I believe that Scali EO uses some AI
So
to
Scully, yes,
perform some sort of machine learning to also determine exactly what needs to be generated. I haven't used Scali, but what I know is that generates a static version. So
yep,
it generates a ready HTML, which is uh, obviously it's sort of better, but it's not. I guess it's not applicable to all the cases. Angular is general purpose. You can
yep,
generate anything,
yep,
it will work, but it will always be built from scratch. So when you load an Angular single page app that is built on Angular, it's gonna render from zero. You don't have any ready HTML. It's being rendered.
yep,
If you write something like div and span, those HTML elements are going to be converted to JavaScript commands.
yep.
The same with React, actually. If you don't use Gatsby in React
Mm-hmm.
or other tools like that, in React, if you write JSX, if you write return div something something, what
It's a
it
JavaScript.
actually gets translated to is React.createElement, which is a function that React has, and it gets an argument string that says it's a div. So basically, you're actually just writing JavaScript. You're not writing HTML. You're just writing something that looks like HTML but could turn to JavaScript. So the difference is the dynamic aspect. The Scali, EO, or Gatsby are going to generate a static site built with entire HTML script to get all the components, find out which CSS belongs to which part of the application, and present you with a ready page. What you build with React or Angular purely with the usual build process is that you get a JavaScript command set that describes how your
How it
application should be built.
should render.
It's
Yep.
not a good bad thing. Those are just different things. It depends on the context. It depends on why you are using any of them.
Exactly. Okay. I think yeah, Guru Raj had. Okay. So
Thanks.
yeah. So Ramesh has a question. With the naming convention and grouping by feature, how should we take layering? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I guess no, I understand. I mean, he means nested folders and
Okay.
features.
Mhm.
Yes,
Okay. 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 Okay.
we actually partly covered it in when I
Hmm.
was talking to you.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. I think
I can just if
we
you
should.
yeah if you just share my screen again, I will
Hmm.
just show this. Actually, the same thing is that I go. My general rule is file names should be unique or at least try to be as unique as they are. So in this example, I have an articles folder with effects and all the state things, actions, adapters, entity, reducer, blah, blah,
Hmm.
blah, everything that I need with for NGRX. All this stuff, I still named them explicitly. I said articles.actions,
Hmm.
articles.something, and so on. For example, Angular CLI does the same thing. When you generate a
Yep.
component, say you
Yep.
generate a component called calendar. Okay,
Hmm.
it will generate a folder called calendar, but inside it will have calendar.component.ts. It won't have component.ts and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
styles.ts. It will have the full name, so you can easily find a file. It's always easier if you have unique file names. And the same goes for everything else. If you have, for example, if I have a folder that has models in it, like business logic models, like user model, I always say user model models, user.model.ts.
Yep.
So I can
Mm.
easily find the user
The
model file
module.
as
Yep.
opposed to user effect file or user component file. So
Exactly.
you have to keep that not only in the Angular. It's in the style guide. You can actually go to the style guide and the Angular style guide documentation page and just extrapolate that advice to all the folders you have.
That's cool. Okay, I think yeah, this is something you mentioned during the talk. If your application is big enough to use Angular, then it's big enough to use NGRX. I think
I
I
think
do
now
agree.
there are three of us.
So, like I do agree to that. I mean, I have worked in an application like 10K lines of code without NGRX, and I have now been working on a new application with NGRX. I can see the difference, and yes, it was it was needed. Okay, so Indrajit has a question. What about static site generator like Scully? Is hybrid application better or normal application partially pre-rendered? I mean, are there any downside of partially pre-rendered application. I think this is something which we covered about.
Yeah,
So it's up to your use case, right? So what you really want to
yeah,
do.
definitely.
Of
Yeah.
course, yeah. Of course, static sites
It's
generators,
not a
static sites are
good or
faster.
bad thing. Yeah,
Yeah,
of
yeah,
course. It's like
yeah.
more of a use case.
Use case, exactly. So
Yeah.
that's what we do have. Okay, I think Rohan Patil. Thanks, Rohan. Uh, Ramesh has a question. How can we handle or answer the complaint on the boilerplate code we have writing or what
I
we have
think you
to
mean writing to use
writing to use
Angular.
NGRX? Yeah. So
Well, there are two things I can say on that. Is boilerplate really that bad? Is boilerplate a bad thing? Like boilerplate is code that is basically 100% safe. You always know that it works. Like when you write an Angular component, you obviously don't complain that you have to have the
yeah,
component decorator with stuff. No, it's just thing that works. You have to write, right? So obviously it's not a bad thing. It's just a safe piece of code
exactly,
that
exactly.
works. On the other hand, obviously, you can always a bit optimize all the things that you do. For example, today, what I did was I had a big reducer with lots of, I used the create reducer utility
Mhm.
from NGRX, and I had lots of commands that says on this action, do this, on this action. So I had, I guess, 20 or 25 like lines of the same thing for different state pieces. So I just separated them into different folders, made them into arrays of actions, and just imported them so the code looked more neat, and my files didn't exceed like 50 lines of code. I
Yeah,
had more. It's always better to have more files with less code than a single big file with lots of logic in it. That's
exactly.
the first thing we do. We can always apply that to NGRX boilerplate too. What I also did, I wrote a utility. You can always do that. I wrote a utility function that takes three type options. Every time in NGRX, when you load data from server, you usually create three actions, right? Like
Yeah.
load data, load
Load
data
and
success, load data error. So I just created a function that creates those three actions immediately. It's called create HTTP action. It receives
okay.
the type strings and just adds success and error to the type that you write, action type, and you then it's a generic function, so it receives the
Mm.
type. The first type argument is the payload that you are sending to the server. The next type argument is what you receive from the server, the response, and the third type optional is maybe error has some data on it if your
That's good.
option is provided. So this is one way to reduce boilerplate. You can also come up with functions that, for example, also one great way to reduce boilerplate, obviously use entity, use
Ah,
NGRX entity.
that's really
Most usually when you use NGRX, you have crude create,
yeah.
read, update,
Read
delete.
update.
So you have a list of data. You have you need to add one item to the list. You need to delete one item. So there's a lot of boilerplate, obviously
Exactly.
boilerplate code. You can just create an entity adapter, call the methods that it has. Your reducer will go from this to this.
Exactly.
That's another great way of reducing boilerplate. Also, sometimes people suggest using NGRX data, though I don't like NGRX data because
You're
it sort
not
of defeats
alone.
the yeah.
Yeah.
But again, if your concern is that maybe I'm gonna skip on writing the reducers and stuff like that, still NGRX data still can be used in that case. But I always suggest you write all the things explicitly that you need. Sometimes you don't need all the things.
Yeah. I think this is the one question which we left. So this is related to the
Yeah, we can.
service. Yeah. So best
Yeah.
practices for handling errors. Yeah.
So again, it depends on what you use. So it depends on two things. It depends on technologies you use, whether you use NGRX, whether you use imperative approach, whether you use RxJS. On the other hand, it depends on the use case. Sometimes you have this application. For example, the application that I'm working right now at my job, it has very simple error handling. It just shows a red notification up there that says something happened. Please try this. So what I did, I wrote an effect that subscribes to all the
Okay.
and then filtered the ones that are that have an error property
Oh,
to filter
okay.
the error one, and just display the message. So I don't handle any HTTP errors on myself because always the use case is the same.
Oh,
On the
that's
other hand, sometimes errors come with a payload, like they describe something. For example, you did something in your app, you can't do that because some data is missing or some business logic. So if you use NGRX, you can just add an error state to your and it's not sometimes you think, oh, where I should handle this an RxJS effect is somewhere there and my component is here, error is happening here. How I handle it? You don't handle it in the component. Again, you have an error state which describes, well, this error happened with this message, for example. You select it from the state. Obviously, if there is an error, you write an ngIf directive. If there is an error, you display the relevant structure that describes it. So it's one way. If you don't use NGRX, then I guess if you don't use NGRX, maybe it would be even better that you don't even use RxJS. At least convert them to promises, use async await, put them into try catch. That's also an approach if you don't use NGRX. That's another approach. It's not as good as NGRX, but it still works. It's still readable. So I guess if you don't want to go the NGRX way, so you convert to promises after you have applied all the operators you need. Sometimes you need the operator. Convert to promise. It's in this case it would be acceptable. Use try catch. It still is better than writing subscribe and the catcher and something. It's a big structure. Try catch is at least a native structure to the language. So I guess in that case it will be better.
Okay, so I think there is another question from Shashank. He says, in order to handle date, which one is recommended? I think nowadays your Chrome is telling you not to use Moment.js. So
yeah, I don't like that feature.
I think it's okay, but I think Moment.js has some problem, like it's not reshakable. So I think if you can use DateFNS, I think you should go and use DateFNS because Moment.js has already
don't work with dates, man.
Yeah. Don't work with date if you can. So, but yeah. So Moment.js is anyways going to be stopped. So they are not going to support any new feature or any new bug fixes. So of course you have to look for.
If you think that again, if you import DateFNS or Moment just for one single thing, then that you can spend like 30 minutes to fix that. Just don't use any of them. You don't really need that. If you, for example, want to convert one date from one time zone to another, you don't need Moment.js.
Actually,
you can calculate that. Yeah, it's a problem, but you can. Well, first you can just Google it. There are answers on Stack Overflow. Obviously, you don't need to, but you can also, like, if you have a bit time, like half an hour, 40 minutes, you can actually spend the time. It would be also useful for your skills to try to like solve a problem that is a bit out of the business logic, like working with dates. Sometimes you don't need it, so it depends.
I think Virat has a question. What would be the right way to do component communication using PubSub, using observable, or use services?
Oh man, use NGRX.
Use NGRX, exactly.
You don't need component communication.
Exactly.
Actually, you don't need. Actually, I think having an output on a component, if it's not a presentation component, it's a bad practice to have an output that outputs some data for something. You should output a native event if it's really needed in another.
Exactly.
For example, user clicked somewhere in a presentation component. You have logical components and presentation components, right? Stateful, stateless, like in React. It's the same. You can use the same pattern we usually do. Use outputs to communicate to the parent. If this is let's say, for example, if there is a native event, like you click somewhere, you don't really handle it here, you just pass the event up. That's a use case for output. Okay. Also, one thing, this is a good question because sometimes people neglect using control value accessor. Sometimes people have a data input, for example, and then they will write an output that will emit when something changes on the form where user types something. You don't need to do that. Your component can implement control value accessor, and then you can just use ng model or form control on your component. That is possible. If you have never thought about it, think of it like this. If you have worked with PrimeNG or Material, Angular Material, any library, they all have components that represent controls, right? They have a material input and they're custom components, but you can put ng model on them. And if you think about it, well, it has to work some way, right? It's not an input, but so you can, if you're not familiar with control value accessor, in like 30 or 40% cases, the actual communication that you really want to do is just a form control flow, like data that is changed on the control. You need to pass it up. You don't need event emitters for that. Just implement control values. in the parent component, use form. Don't, there is a nice interface between the two. You don't need event emitters. So best case, if you are at the beginning of your application and you ask, well, what's the good use ngrx, and in other cases use control value
Control
true
value.
for data change, and in the native event cases use output only for that.
Okay, so there are a few questions from Twitter, so which we had collected before, and
Yeah.
we have already discussed about few, but I don't want to leave them. So
Yeah.
there was a question by Praveen. So his question was, what is ideal situation scenario in real world paradigm where NGRX is preferred to use? I think we, Praveen, in case you are watching this or in future you watch this, we already discussed about this, everything
Yeah.
about NGRX, where it is used and how to structure your application. And okay, so there was another question from Praveen again. So his question was ADL authentication. So Praveen, I mean, ADL authentication is something I remember. There was an older library in days of AngularJS. I think it still exists, but I'm not sure about if there is any new implementation about this library. You can just go to MSDN docs. I think they do have some documentation about ADL authentication. Of course, they support all the services which they have on Azure, ADL being one. They also have some helper functions or helper packages which are available, so you can see them. In case you don't get the answer, you can reach out to me on Twitter. I'll connect to someone from the Azure team or from the Microsoft team who can actually answer that. And then we do have bunch of questions from Ankit. So Ankit, in case you are listening or you just watch this in future, so you had multiple questions. The first question was, should we consider configuring an Angular app from scratch rather than using Angular CLI for smaller projects? So I think you should always,
Always
yeah, always rely.
CLI, yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
You don't want to. It's
yeah,
it's not. It should be a very like weird, exotic case that you would
yeah.
want to switch from CLI, and you really have like extremely good reason to not use CLI. CLI is great. Like I don't
CLI.
think anyone is complaining about CLI.
Yeah, so this was the first question you had.
So,
And
yeah.
yeah, so another question you had was related to the animation. Uh, so this was the question: should we use for animating Angular animation API or CSS? So what do you think, Armin? I mean, what you will
Well,
prefer?
I'm not really strong in writing animations.
Yeah, same
So
here. I
it
mean,
depends. It depends. Angular animation obviously gives you a bit something you can easily. If you, for example, if animation needs some logic, like in this case, it only needs to work. Usually, if you do that only via CSS, you will need to like pass a class, use ng class here, then write an animation, then attach it to a class. So it's a bit more implicit. In that cases, you would probably want to revert to Angular animations. There you can use logic on your animations, like display this animation only in this case. If the animation is something really small, you don't really want to bring Angular animations aren't by default in your app.
yep,
You will increase your bundle size if you use, and you will increase your bundle size with no good reason if you can write like 5 lines for one animation. So consider that carefully. Usually apps that are written in Angular are enterprise apps. You don't need too many animations for them.
exactly.
You don't need floating things, I
Yeah,
don't know, in most cases. So if you do need, of course, go ahead, use Angular animation. It's easier. Obviously animations are going to be hard at that point, but one, two small animations, you can always do that by CSS. We can always find answers on Stack Overflow, like every animation that exists. Pretty
exactly.
sure there is a CSS implementation. So don't go for Angular animations if you don't really have a good reason.
So I think we also discussed about this reducing bundle size for CLI generated app. We
Yeah,
saw we
definitely.
can do lazy loading and all the
It
stuffs we
does.
can add.
Also, we should mention that it does tree shaking.
Yeah. So
So
bunch of questions. So he still have four. So best ways to create extensible and future-proof component. I think we also discussed about how we can extend a component,
yeah.
how we can use the best practices, RxJS and GRX. So you can do that.
Also, maybe another important
Hmm.
point that we can add is never add business logic to a component that
Component.
doesn't need it.
Exactly.
I have witnessed a component that was essentially a form control that was aware of a data loading service. That was crazy. I wanted to
Yeah.
reuse that component somewhere. It was impossible because it was working with another entity and I'm working with another entity. Your component should be divided into two parts. Presentation ones
Presentation and
should be aware about. Also, rule of thumb, for example, if you have control value accessible component, you shouldn't inject anything. Like it's a control component. You should only receive inputs, display something, work with the Angular forms, and that's it. If it injects a service and does something, then it already is horrible. You should really change that because it's
yeah,
not flexible at all after that point.
exactly. Okay, so the next question is saving network calls using RxJS. I think you can always rely on NGRX to do that for you.
I guess
NGRX is
we can just change the title of this discussion just that how great is NGRX? People Tech
yeah,
Talk with
actually.
Santosh, episode 7. How great is NGRX?
Handling multiple async calls with RxJS over promises. Don't use promises at
Uh,
all.
the same thing when you have the promises, you have promise all or promise raise. All of those things are present in RxJS. You don't need NGRX for that. Even if you prefer not to, you still can do the same. So fork join is the same that promise all, and or race is the same as promise race. So those both are covered. I also believe there is promise all settled.
Yeah, the new API.
Yeah, you can do that using catch error, obviously, on every observable that you're handling together. But you really don't need if you're using async pipe, you don't really need combining multiple things.
Yeah, exactly.
You can just you don't need actually you don't need combining several calls. It's not a real. If you are 100% honest, it's not a real use case. Where I need those three pieces of data loaded at the same time. No, if you have the correct structure, they can load in any way. That's why
Yeah,
we
exactly.
try to have ArcGIS plus async pipe.
Yeah. Cool. So I think the rest of questions are already taken care during the discussion. So okay, so it's almost how much? More than 100 minutes. So it was supposed to be 45 minutes, and
This will
we
beat
did.
the record.
We should have done 2 episodes. Oh my god. But yes, I think this is going to be really useful for a lot of the developers because we discussed everything in more detail. So if you watch it in future, I think this will be really helpful for the years to come, I'm sure. And thanks a lot, Armin. I mean, for like giving your time. We like extended the time by an hour, but you still uh, you're still there and you are still answering the question. So thanks a lot for that.
Thanks for having me. Of course, I'm just very happy to share with my experience.
That's awesome. So, Armin, I mean, I know you work as a senior Angular developer, but do you want to promote anything on the channel so we can do that?
Um, I didn't really think about that too much, to be
Okay.
honest.
Okay. Cool.
Just go, just I don't know. Indef is already promoted this. If you are interested, go take a look at my articles. They're also
Mhm.
there. So I guess
Yeah.
that's probably
So I'll,
maybe follow me on Twitter. I don't know. I sometimes post interesting things. So I
yep.
guess.
So yep. So I'll be sharing the link. I mean, in the description. I'll add that later on. But you can actually go ahead and find Armen on indep.dev. You can just go to the homepage and then you'll be able to find a lot of articles from Armen. So they're really useful. I was really inspired by the article he wrote about the bad practices, and that's how this idea came in. And I just reached out to him, Armen, let's do an episode. And Armen was like, yes, let's do it,
Yeah,
man.
that was a very prideful moment. I mean, you're a Google developer expert, and
Uh,
like, yeah,
I
as
mean,
a
it doesn't
guy, I
matter,
guess
right? It
maybe.
doesn't matter. I mean, everyone is
Yeah,
like sharing
yeah,
doing
but
their best.
I mean, like, yeah. Oh, I mean, the stuff that I was writing wasn't that bad.
It
I'm
was really
sure
an
about
amazing.
it. Yeah, but I guess I hope that what I write and what we talk today is helpful to other
Yeah,
developers, obviously.
cool. So I'll share the link to that article as well. I think I'll share to a link to the in-depth so you can find all the articles by Armin. And just to give you an idea, we have our next episode starting October. So we have next episode on 9th October. We don't have anything on 2nd October because we have a public holiday in India, so I don't want to keep anything. So we'll meet on 9th October. In next episode, we have another Google developer expert. So he's the organizer of NGBE, NG Belgium, Sam. He'll be joining us on 9th to discuss about the evolution of web development, actually. Especially front end, right? So we are not going to discuss about the back end stuff. We are going to discuss about how front end evolved over the years. The timing will be same, 9th October. In case you want to just get updated with the latest or upcoming shows, you can just go to my portfolio, santosh.yadav.dev, and you will be able to find a link called Tech Talks with Santosh. You can see the upcoming shows, and you can subscribe to my channel to get the updates on the future shows. So that's it for the day, and thanks for joining us. In case you have any feedbacks, you can send it over Twitter or LinkedIn, or I think some of you are also watching it on Facebook. I'll be able to read comments after this show. So in case you have anything to share, please do that. Thank you. Thanks a lot, and
Thanks, everyone.
have a good night, and have a great weekend as well. So, yep, thank you.